Welcome to the March 2023 Inrange Q&A. Questions provided by kind and generous Patreon and Utreon supporters. I asked this month to sort of curate the questions to night vision, night fighting, night matches, and most of the questions are around that because we just got done with Midnight Brutality. But there's a couple questions in here that aren't that too, so if that's not your bag, there's some others in here for you as well. We just got done with Midnight Brutality. There will be more than one full Midnight Brutality video coming out, both white light, night vision, other stuff, lessons learned. There's going to be a lot of content generated from that match, not just about the match, but about the learning experience that it was. And I'm going to get into some of that with the questions here today. So why don't we go ahead and get started, and we can go from there. So, Henry S., what was the most cursed night fighting setup you saw? Oh, that's an easy one. Honestly, it was Ian's. He brought out, he tried to shoot twice. He shot once with a thermal setup and did quite well with that. But then he tried to shoot with a modern nods, but with retro gear. And he had this AR carbine suited up with the earliest of early night vision fighting equipment. He had a laser on it that, I don't know what year it was, 80s, early 90s, I'm not even sure. But it didn't throw out a standard consistent beam. It was in the IR spectrum, but it blinked. So instead of sending a beam out there, it did this blinking thing, which, by the way, at one point, that was kind of the rage. Even the Russian red dots were doing this blinking thing. You turn them on and they would blink, with this idea that it would draw your eye to it. And for whatever reason, this early IR laser designator blinked. It didn't throw out one beam, it just did this blinking thing, which that's not a good idea. It's terrible. Trying to find the dot, even with your nods on, is going to be a challenge. And then he had some old aim point on it that didn't even have a night vision setting. It had a, so the lowest setting would still bloom out. So even if you couldn't, in theory, if you couldn't find the laser, you should be able to still go passive behind the red dot, but then it bloomed out. And so it looked cool, but I wasn't there to watch him shoot, but apparently after like two stages, I think, 2 or 3 of the stages out of the 6, he just quit. He said it was impossible. So it looked cool, it was old and retro, and it was absolutely cursed. So that was the most cursed night fighting setup I saw, for sure. G3 Yost. Are your eyes fried like tuna steaks when hit with a normal intensity light while wearing NVGs? Well, depends on what you're doing. First of all, I was using this OPSIN, but I also do have a PVS 7, and I've used PVS 14s. And of course, some units go over one eye, some units go over 2 eyes. If you're hit with a very bright white light, a proper night vision setup should automatically adjust to that. And while it isn't necessarily good for a traditional analog tube, it's not going to suddenly sear your eyes with extraordinary light. Now, if you have one eye that's not with night vision and have it open, that one's going to lose any and whatever night vision adjustment you had. Not night vision, but night adjustment. So your pupil, of course, will get thrashed, and you're going to have to lose all of your natural night vision that you've acquired by being in the dark. But any decent, even relatively old, but still not completely ancient night vision setup, whether it's, obviously the digital one does very well with this, but even old school PVS 7s will auto adjust for something like that. Now, it might blind your ability to see what's downrange, and it might be effective in terms of making you unable to hit targets, but it won't actually like sear your eyes or cause some sort of like white blindness or anything like that. Unless your stuff is ancient, and I don't think even then it would. It just might be more problematic. But the optic will automatically attempt to adjust, and you're not going to get like eye damage or even night blindness as a result of it, even temporarily. Anything more than you would if someone shined a flashlight in your eyes when you're walking around the house. In fact, the eye without the night vision will get probably more bothered by that white light being shined at you than the one with the optic on it. Chris S. Did you learn anything surprisingly unexpected from the nighttime brutality matches? New techniques or problems no one expected? Well, yeah, there's a lot, and frankly, this is only one of many. And so, like I said, there's going to be a video that's going to cover a lot of these topics or videos. But the thing that really caught me off guard, and I guess it makes sense and it's not a surprise, but I just didn't think about it, was we have a white light division at the match. And that means people bringing out no night vision gear, just literally white lights, and weapon mounted or otherwise. And in many situations and environments, if you don't need the tactical advantage of what night vision does, being able to see when hopefully someone else can't, if you don't need that, and the object of the goal is dynamic, fast shooting, white light absolutely is a viable option. In fact, in many instances, it was the advantage. It was the advantageous setup. So when you're under night vision, even with high quality stuff, there's still a limited field of view. You're probably aiming with a laser, which is actually quite effective, more effective than I thought it would be even on the clock. I've done a lot of practice off the clock, but on the clock's different, right? But when you're shooting with good quality white lights and enough and sufficient white light, you can use the gun like it's day. You aim through the optic normally, and all of your normal weapon handling and manipulations are natural and normal. There's no learning curve there. There's learning curve in terms of turning the light on, turning the light off, and dealing with some of those situations, not blinding yourself with a wall in front of you when you're trying to illuminate something behind it. But white light in many situations was absolutely the right answer, at least in terms of the problems we were proposing, such as 100-yard mini IPSC targets through a VTAC barricade with running. Moving rapidly in night vision, when you don't have all of your normal depth perception and you're sort of seeing the world through a straw, is a learned skill. And I personally moved much slower running back and forth in stages or navigating the course of fire than I would have with a white light. Now, of course, if you're turning on a white light in the real world, you are a giant target. So white light, you normally would activate the white light, engage, disengage the white light, move. And that's the same thing you should do with an IR laser and IR illuminator as well, because you don't know if the opposing force or whatever you're dealing with also has night vision. But it was very interesting to see that when people were using white light, how much, and I'm not deprecating their performance because they use white light, but how much easier it was for them to do natural shooting and solve shooting problems with that white light, even at range with the right white light. So Sinistral Rifleman had lights on his gun that made essentially the entire range look like daylight. He had a Rain 3.0 and something else, a Surefire or something, and there were times where he turned both on, and I'll splice some of that in here. I filmed this through the OPSIN, and you'll see that even at past 150 yards, he's lighting up the range like no problem. Now, that still didn't make shooting distance targets easy. In fact, the obstacle course, which was the longest range targets we presented, was still a challenge, was actually the biggest challenge for white light. But within 100 yards in, 50 yards in, dynamic movement, that white light kind of ruled. And so as a result, I would say that while night vision technology, IR spectrum or other, is very fun and interesting and has tactical application, of course, the average person training with a good white light setup and getting good with it is not to be underestimated. Jane B. Have you found any unusual or unexpected uses or perks of night vision outside of a shooting context? Well, I mean, it's actually pretty fun to go walking around in the desert with night vision on. It's one way to get your night vision legs, for lack of a better term, being able to move around without tripping and stumbling over something. Driving with night vision is interesting if you can disable the lights in your system. Of course, do this in a safe place. Don't do this with other people around. That would be unwise. Quite honestly, looking up at the night sky is amazing. Imagine all the light amplification you're getting from light amplification systems, digital or otherwise, and you look up at the night sky and it's like a little tiny, amazing, better than gigantic reflector telescope just sitting on your head. The sky becomes literally a table that looks like salt has been poured over it in terms of stars. The Milky Way, even like messier objects or old long deep space objects, nebulae. The Andromeda Galaxy shows up in night vision incredibly well. Looking up at the night sky is amazing. And some of the digital units, which I'm going to talk more about OPSIN in another video again, provide other things, like it has like a heads-up display with cardinal directions. It gives me my GPS coordinates, and I can record with it. Those are all really cool features. But in terms of just light amplification through any form of night vision equipment of any quality, walking around, navigating at night, and being able to not disrupt the environment around you. So, for example, animal observation is really cool with night vision. And the night sky will blow your mind. McKuuurds. McKuuurds. I noticed in your OPSIN video that when switching between ambient light amplification and IR illumination, the video would switch to what I'm guessing is the IR sensor and would only illuminate the flood from the IR light and would crush everything else in black. How does this affect your decisions for shooting the stages? Okay, well, this topic is a big deal. It's not just the OPSIN. This is the use of light in general. There's another question that's getting to this later. But learning how to use your illumination or not use it, and we'll get to that more in this as well, is very important. There's times and places where you want IR flood, and there's times and places where you want really compact, short, small degree of long distance throw. That goes for white light and IR light, but it's particularly problematic with IR light and using some sort of night vision amplification unit. The OPSIN has a particularly interesting feature in it being digital that analog tubes can't, in that it can deal with white light, IR light. It auto-adjusts to whatever the light source is, regardless of the spectrum it's in, up to and including walking out of the inky blackness of the desert into a brightly lit house. The OPSIN automatically adjusts, and it just kind of does a flash, and then it adjusts with it. Yeah, how you use your light, and there's the last question I think on this Q&A this month's going to get into this a little deeper, and the lights you're using for illumination absolutely matter, and you have to tune them based on the firing conditions and what you're trying to identify at the time. These things, you don't just turn them on and use them. That's one of the things that was, I knew that already going into this, but it was one of the lessons of the Brutality match was the OPSIN or any high-end night vision equipment, if you don't tune it, you don't just turn it on and use it, and you don't just turn on an IR illuminator and expect it to be the right solution for that situation. You have to kind of learn what to do, what to turn on, when not to turn it on, and how to adjust your contrast settings, gain, etc., to get the most out of your night vision equipment based on the environment you're currently dealing with. And so, yeah, that's a thing. Let me get to more of that later in other questions. Dalbunosky. How good were the flash hiders at hiding flash? Well, I'll snip it in a little bit here. I ran a regular A2 flash hider. This is the gun I used for Midnight Brutality. I'm rebuilding an entire new night vision rig after this. Lessons learned. This was sufficient. The laser was fine, but lots of things I would change, and that'll be a different video. But I ran a standard A2 flash hider, and the A2 flash hider actually does a fantastic job. With the right ammo and an A2 flash hider, and if you see some of my footage, the flash from the flash hider is not a problem. What is a problem, though, is the smoke emitted from the gunfire. That has nothing to do with the flash. It has to, of course, to do with particulate and matter from the burning powder of the ammunition. And that under white light is a problem. Under IR light, it's a real problem. That smoke hanging out there can absolutely make it impossible to see targets or hit things. And the real answer to that, from what I've seen, and while there still is smoke, of course, besides the fact of flash suppression and noise suppression, is a suppressor. A good, properly configured night fighting gun needs a suppressor. This was the first instance in which the suppressor, besides being a tactical advantage against shooting at a target and it not being able to identify the location of the gunfire, the real application of the suppressor that I've seen ever is in this night fighting application. You put the suppressor on there, flash is all but gone with a good suppressor, and the smoke, while it is still present, is still channeled along with everything else that's going on through the chambers of the suppressor, and it changes the issue of the smoke from the gunfire dramatically under white or IR light. So I will tell you that a dedicated night fighting gun should absolutely have a suppressor. That said, the A2 flash hider did extraordinarily well. All right, PHILLIP W. Thoughts? This is not a night fighting one. Thoughts on the M1 Garand safety? Why don't more firearms use it? I think the M1 Garand safety is actually very ergonomic and easy to use, but we have gone away from, and should have, this is the right answer, controls for the firearm inside of the trigger guard. The only thing that should be inside the trigger guard is a trigger. Same thing we argued about the Magpul bad lever that puts something into the trigger guard. I've personally seen it cause NDs or ADs. Your mileage may vary. I've seen it more than once though. And while the M1 Garand safety doesn't lend itself to that, it still makes you put your finger into the just in front of the trigger to disengage it. And that's just not good doctrine. It certainly is ergonomic on the gun, and I don't think it's really a problem. But if we can do it better than that, we should do it better than that. And I think the reason we don't see it on more firearms is because we've gotten away from that concept, because we've gone to a better idea of not having controls inside of the trigger guard beyond the trigger itself. Matt C. How important is optical clarity when shooting white light at distance? At Midnight Brutality, I noticed I could often see the target with the naked eye, but it was much more difficult through the optic. Optical clarity is an interesting question. First of all, optical clarity is one thing. I think the thing that you're looking for more here is light transmission. Your eye is a very sensitive visual piece of visual vision equipment, and if you allow yourself to adjust to the night environment, and you're now have your night vision on, not night vision as in equipment, but your night vision in terms of adjusted to the darkness, your ability to perceive things in the dark is actually quite good, even on just starlight. And any optic you look through is going to be passing light through a pane of glass or panes of glass. The diameter of the optic, the light, the actual coatings on the glass, if there are any. For example, Vortex is well known for having a blue hue to the glass. That is an absolute no-go in a night environment. It will deprecate the light transmission dramatically. EOTechs are well regarded as having the best light transmission. First of all, they have a large pane of glass, and because they're a holographic sight, they don't need a coating on the glass itself for the holograph or the reticle to be visible to the shooter. And therefore, you have some of the best light transmission you can get. Not a lot of panes of glass, and they're not heavily coated, means good light transmission. So what you're seeing there is your naked eye, without having to pass light through multiple, or at least a glass pane of glass that may or may not have a coating, is why you're able to see something outside of the optic, then look into the optic and not see it anymore. You're literally losing just enough light transmission that it can't make it through the glass. This is the same thing in astronomy, light transmission, and there are some coatings on glass that actually try to improve light transmission while protecting the lens. But what you want is the clearest, cleanest, least obstructive, least coated, highest light transmission piece of glass in front of you at night, and EOTechs are one of the best options for that. So that's what you're running into there, and we'll probably talk about that a lot more in the future. Windwalker 57. Have you ever considered incorporating parachute flares into a stage? Oh, I'm glad you asked. The answer is yes. And those of you who are going to Woodland Brutality might get to experience something like that. Yep. I just dropped a little bit of a sneak peek. Knathaniel C. I've been enjoying your miniseries about CCW guns. I have a question about early pocket revolvers. Is the suicide/Saturday Night Special a myth? There's all sorts of rumors about small revolvers like Ivor Johnson's, Hopkins and Allen's, or unnamed Belgian imports being fit for use only once or even only suited for harming the user. Would you bank your life on a Hopkins and Allen, or would you save up for something like a Colt New Line for reliable protection? This is interesting. I've got a number of these because I collect them and I find them interesting, and I love Old West guns, as those of you who watch the channel know. And here's what I've come to find. I think if you find like an Ivor Johnson that's been essentially put in a pocket and hasn't been used much, those guns are actually a lot better than people give them credit for. They frequently were bought cheaply and abused and not dealt with well by the user or the owner, and you'll find a lot of these Ivor Johnsons and cheaper Old West revolvers are now sort of road rough and put away wet, and therefore they're kind of beat up, mechanical parts are broken, etc. For the average person seeking self-defense in the Old West, buying an Ivor Johnson and shooting it just enough to get good enough with it to understand how to use it, and then taking good care of it, it would be absolutely sufficient for occasional shooting and self-defense. They don't just blow up in one shot. They're not completely break-o-matics. They're actually quite reliable, very good reasonably quality guns. Now, that said, every time I've ever come across a Colt or one of the higher end manufacturers that made a similar competitive gun, like a pocket revolver, they're in better shape. Whether that means that the person who owned it took better care of it because they spent more money on it, or they were just better built, is a question. I don't have the data set for that. I will tell you that when you hold a Colt and you hold an Iver Johnson in your hand, the Colt definitely has a better fit and feel and feels like a higher quality gun. But I would not understate that an Iver Johnson or even a Hopkin Allen's was useless, and saving a little money back then if you weren't going to actively shoot it every weekend was probably a very reasonable answer. And if you didn't mistreat them, those cheaper guns, for the most part, some of the Belgian ones are problematic, and there's definitely some cheap stuff that's just no good. But of the examples you provided, I would not have felt very concerned about carrying an Iver Johnson then, and I have Iver Johnson in my collection now that still work great. So I think a lot of it is based on the owner, the user, how they handled them and how they treated them. But were the Colts nicer? Yeah, they were nicer. They're absolutely nicer. But I wouldn't say that these other guns were absolutely useless or that they were suicide specials. HiRoAZ. Is an IR laser? It seems that lining up sights might be difficult. Well, first of all, if you're using night vision equipment, such as an OPSIN or a PVS-14 or any other form of nods, you're not using iron sights. You focus essentially to quote-unquote infinity, or you focus to the rooms or the area you think you're going to be in. If you're going to be door kicking, you'll focus to the distance of the room that you're going to be in so you can focus on what's in front of you. There's a little focusing knob on all night vision equipment that allows you to focus to close or range. And if you focus close on your sights, which it would be possible to focus the focus to see the front sight, you would then, everything behind it would be a complete and utter blur and useless. So you're going to focus to what you need to be able to identify and see, and therefore you're not using iron sights. Now, if you raise a optic high enough with a riser, such as an EOTech, you can tilt the gun or your head or both to see through this, and you can still use an EOTech reticle in passive. And one of our divisions, in fact, was passive at the match. And that works just fine because that just superimposes on front of the focus you already have, which is whatever it is you need to focus on. But you would never be using iron sights. That said, the IR laser is an incredibly useful piece of technology. If whatever you're shooting at does not also have the ability to see infrared, this is invisible to the normal eye, and therefore you have this beam of light coming out of your gun that looks like a lightsaber that allows you to shoot and actively and reliably hit targets really at range with non-standard shooting positions and or even standard traditional shooting positions. And I mean, you can shoot from the hip with an IR laser and nods, and you can hit stuff doing that. An IR laser is essential, and it's a very important part of a night fighting gun. Like I said, there's a lot of components, and I'm going to go into another video that I think lessons learned to me going on the clock and doing this, what I would have done differently, and you really need to think of all of this as a system, not one individual piece. The IR laser is only part of the solution, the nods is part of the solution, the suppressor is another part, etc. But I would say yes, an IR laser is essential and very useful in the right situations and in most of the situations. And that's why really most night fighting solutions, even militarily speaking, passive is good in that you don't emit any emanations, meaning IR laser or desert or light. But passive can be difficult with light transmission and identifying targets and being dynamic. You can be more dynamic with an IR laser. Rory, I found out my Olight wasn't up to the job. What light was best for reaching the ranges that you set up on stage 6? That's the obstacle course. We had targets out past 150 yards out there, and we were throwing it across a canyon. This same problem exists with IR illuminators, and that'll be again something else I'll talk about more. But when it comes to white light, Fagan's solution worked great. He had issues with the battery contacts, but he had a Rain 3. And that thing sent out a beam that went way out into the distance. Now, you have a couple things that were going on with lights, whether they're IR lights or white lights. There's like lumens, which everyone talks about lumens, which is the brightness of the light. And there's candela, which kind of roughly translates to throw, the distance the light can reach. I'm not a white light guy, so you guys that are, don't like start a war about if I'm a little bit off on this. But let me just rough this up. You have a flood, which is a white light that goes and can be very bright, but it really only illuminates out to about 50 yards. but then you can have more concentrated lights that throw out however many lumens, but also reach much further. And when you see Fagan's Rain 3 shooting out at this, it really does throw well past 200 yards. He was able to illuminate targets past 200 yards with white light. And at this event, that it was like, brightness is one thing, but throw is another. And you want to find the right solution for the situation you're in that meets both of those necessary goals at the moment, which means the best thing is a tunable light, or maybe even more than one light. That's a little interesting, and he did that as well. But there's times where you just want flood and you want the room to be completely lit like day, and there's times where you want to have a throw that lights up something 200 yards away. And the light that I saw that did the best on that was the Rain 3.0. The problem with that I had some battery issues with, in which the contacts were flickering and occasionally didn't stay functional. And I think that has something to do with the batteries, not the optic itself. The batteries it comes with apparently are not that great. So if you get a Rain 3, replace the batteries, make sure everything's cranked down tight. But the Rain 3 absolutely threw light well past the targets we were presenting for people to see. Wayne I. What was the coolest budget setup, OPSIN price range or lower, that you saw at Midnight Brutality? Well, if you're going to go with some sort of head-mounted night vision equipment, the cheapest thing out there, in my opinion, is that is highly effective. And I understand some of you have issues with digital, but I'm going to keep working with this, and it's a very interesting product, and I actually think it's amazing. And in some instances, it outperformed traditional nods. If you learn to use this properly, tune the gain and the contrast, this can do things that some of the nods at the range couldn't do. Topic aside, if you're going to go with a head-mounted night vision optic, the Psionics OPSIN is a really good price option. $1,600, I think, and is still going to be cheaper than most traditional tubes, and provides some functionality, albeit in some instances less light amplification than traditional tube-based technology. There's some Gen 2 Plus stuff out there that worked most of the time, but there were certain stages that it just couldn't see enough. And we were in very, very poor low light conditions at this event. We were supposed to get a moon eventually, but the moon didn't rise for hours after we started shooting. And then when the moon rose, we got a complete cloud cover that blocked out a lot of its illumination. And some of these stages were even filmed inside of a forest with tree cover. This was as dark in some instances as it got, and you could not walk personally reliably from one end of some of these ranges to another without tripping or stumbling over something, without either night vision or a red light to be able to see what you're seeing, because even with your eyes adjusted, it was too dark to see the ground. So, and the OPSIN handled that well, if you set it properly. It requires tuning. Although traditional night vision does too, if you're going to use it properly, as do your lights. But I think the cheapest, if you're going to go with something head-mounted that's actual night vision, the OPSIN is still what I saw as probably the lowest priced option at the range that was highly effective. Of course, you know what's cheaper than that? White light. I think the Rain 3.0 is $300, and maybe throw another Surefire on there for flood. And if you have two white lights that are able to reach and flood, you kind of got it all knocked out for obviously a lot less than any night vision setup, because you get an OPSIN or even a PVS 14, you still need a laser. You still need IR illuminators. You still need a lot more gear. You need a helmet to mount it to, or some sort of way, even a skull crusher, I guess, to put it on your head. So just getting the optic or the night vision amplification tool is not enough to get you going. That's just part of the solution. So the cheapest, white light. If you want to go night vision, the cheapest I saw that was effective was the OPSIN. Stump. What effect does shooting with night vision have on shooting fundamentals and the ability to view stable positions? Well, it's easy to get sloppy when you're using the laser. You bring the gun up, the laser's on there, and if you don't have that thing tucked in and you're doing the proper thing, it's easy to just launch rounds thinking that the laser is going to magically guide the bullet to the target. And unless you still have a good shooting fundamental in place, you'll still drift off the target, even if the laser was on it when you thought you pressed the trigger. So, as always, getting on a barricade, using a rest, getting a good solid shooting position still applies. The restricted vision window of the night vision equipment means you got to swivel your head a lot more and you've got less field of view. That's one challenge in that regard. But when it comes to shooting positions, the thing that I found most challenging and quite difficult with night vision is to go prone. when you have that on your head and you go prone and you're trying to raise it to see through the optic, through your night vision tube, and also aim the gun, it's very hard. You have to kind of like roll over or do some unusual things. It is not a traditional prone shooting position unless you've adjusted all of your stuff to angle the optic so that when you're prone and you're looking up like this, craning your neck, that the optic lines up. Because remember, you're looking through a tube, you've got to look through the tube. Just because the tube's on your head, if you're prone and craning your head, the optic is not looking to where you want to see. And that is really difficult, at least it was for me, even with a laser. So does using night vision equipment change your shooting positions? It definitely does with prone. It's oddly easier to use in any position other than prone. Always brace off a tree or a stump or a barricade if you can. It does change things a little bit. And like I said, it's easy to get sloppy because you see the laser and you're like, well, the laser's there, it should be fine, and it's not. Phaze, which is less representative of reality, the ffft sound of silencers in movies or the whine of NVGs powering on in the movies? You know, this is interesting because there were some suppressed guns at this match that were so quiet they were impossible to pick up on the timers. They didn't even make a ffft sound. They were the mechanical click of the gun. So that can be reality. Of course, putting a suppressor on 5.56 doesn't do that because you have a supersonic crack. We're talking about subsonic ammunition that's designed for suppressors with a large suppressor. Can be Hollywood quiet. So that's a real thing. They just apply it too universally. And believe it or not, the whine of night vision equipment is no longer real. But I have an old Gen 1 Soviet unit. Yeah, I know, it's Soviet. It's a potato. But, you know, sure enough, when you turn that thing on, it goes poo, and it does make that whine, and whines the whole time you're using it. And super early, old school night vision equipment, particularly Soviet potatoes, do make that whine. More modern equipment does not make any sound at all. You turn it on, it's just working. There's no whine, there's no noise at all. Old night vision equipment can make that whine. So by 2023 standards, I would say that the ft of the suppressor or the silenced gun with the right ammunition and configuration is more representative of reality than the night vision whine. But the night vision whine does have a reality based in history. Nick S. Is a PVS 7 even worth my consideration, or should I start saving up for a 14 or even a binocular setup? I had a 7 with me just to do walking around and stuff. I didn't shoot with the 7. I shot wholly with the OPSIN. And the 7 works. It does give you the ability to do things. I find, personally, I kind of come to find that I prefer, and I thought I didn't, but I do now, prefer having one eye with night vision and one eye without. If there's any ambient light that you can use to navigate the ground, moving, walking, moving in and out of a building, if there's enough ambient light that your non-amplified eye can see anything, I find that it's much easier to use the not night vision eye to move over uneven terrain than it is to try to use the nods, which of course gives you no depth perception. The PVS 7 goes to both eyes, and therefore you don't have an eye that is not getting amplification, and moving over terrain is much more difficult. When I used my PVS 7 to walk around, I actually legitimately never tripped and fell, but I did trip over things and missed things like a hole in front of me that I stumbled around into when I was trying to film or just navigate the range. So I've come to, the PVS 7's work. The light amplification was fine. It's still a Gen 3 tube in there. But personally, I would go with a 14. And if you have the dollars to go with a binocular or even a pano setup, holy mackerel, yeah, you're going to get a lot more. You're increasing your field of view. You're at least providing some level of depth perception that's still amplified. And that is definitely an awesome way to go. It's just awesome dollars too. So if you're going to try to reduce the cost, I would go with a monocular unit. I'm still a fan of this thing. I really am. But a PVS 14 monocular unit is absolutely great. You leave one eye unadjusted from night vision. You can even then still look through your optic with that if you wanted to. Or you could easily go from night vision to, if you had to, your other eye, go to white light. And you've got one eye ready for white light and one eye that's now no longer valid for light amplification until you turn your white light off. So I kind of really still, from my experiences, I'm personally still pretty into the single monocular one eye, night vision one eye not setup. But I have not spent a lot of time in a $10,000 plus binocular or even more pano setup. So if you got the dollars, I guarantee you that a binocular or panoramic setup, pano setup is going to be amazing. But man, it's big dollars. Ryan, not a night vision question. Back in the Wild West days, what was the Native American equivalent to a federal soldier's rations, or supply chain for that matter? Well, this question is answered based differently on the tribe you're talking about. So I'm just going to pick one that I'm more familiar with here in the Arizona region. Of course, the Apache, the Inde, and when they were in the field during the wars, their mainstay for sustenance here was agave. Agave is a giant cactus plant. They didn't have a supply chain. They literally fed off of the land. And agave plants was one of their staples. So, also referred to as mezcal, by the way. Although it's an alcohol, the plant's also mezcal. You'll find an agave plant, they would dig it up, cut all the leaves off, or the stalks, roast it in the ground with a fire, and the meat of an agave plant, mezcal, is absolutely delicious. It's highly sugared, high calorie, and once it's cooked, you can wrap it in a little satchel and put it in your bag or in your pocket or in your pack or whatever, and it will last a long time once it's been cooked and roasted. And it's, like I said, high calorie, high energy. Like, think of it as an energy bar. And it's actually delicious as well. So when it comes to a food supply chain for the indigenous people, they didn't have a supply chain except that which when the government put them on in prison camps and then subsidized them by giving them supplies, many of which were rancid and inedible. Then they had a supply chain. But when they were in the field, again, each tribe had its own approach to this. But for the Apache, it would have been local, mostly harvesting agave and roasting it. And in fact, that was one of the ways when during the campaigns, the wars, the cavalry would find recently set up Apache camps in which they had one point had their tents, their teepees set up, or they had roasted agave, and they could find the holes that the agave had been roasted in, and then they had moved on. So really, they fed off the land, and a lot of salvaging and such was a reality as well. So no supply chain, not the way we think of them. eRahja. How useful are tritium night sights, and have you ever tried them? They're actually very useful. If you're going to be using white light or going with no light at all, in at least ambient light only, not talking night vision, but just ambient light with your normal eyes, tritium night sights are very good. I tend to prefer a standard tritium front post, and I don't care for the two dots in the rear. I can line up the front tritium sight without the rear dots, and it's easier for me. I've heard people argue that you could accidentally misalign tritium like this. You got to be screwing up real bad to move the front sight far enough to the side that it looks like you've moved it over, as well as the front sight tends to be a larger dot than the two in the rear. But tritium sights are very good. They're very useful. They're very good in low light. Not no light, but low light. And yeah, they're effective. I would recommend tritium sights. My personal recommendation is a tritium front sight without tritium rear. Josh W. Not night vision related, but I'm curious about the Inrange Facebook page sharing Red Lobster posts. Is there an inside joke somewhere that I missed, like in Discord or something? So Inrange has no sponsors, no masters, no overlords, no corporate overlords. We have no relationship with any corporation, no sponsorship. But I have said forever that I would accept one sponsorship for brutality matches directly, and that would be Red Lobster. I want them to buffet lunch one of our brutality events. And so they've never replied to me, and I've pinged them on Twitter and Facebook, and I've consistently asked them, like, hey, I want a relationship with Red Lobster, because what speaks to American exceptionalism better than Red Lobster? And having Red Lobster at a brutality match would be amazing. I would play the national anthem, we would bring out the cheese biscuits, and we would have a lobster fest somewhere in the middle of the match. And if Red Lobster, if you're listening, and you want to be part of the brutality match environment, and you want to bring your food and your exceptional American cuisine to my events, I want you there. And so I've been sharing their posts ever since in an attempt to get their attention. Red Lobster, recognize me. Please see me. That's all it's about. Last question. This is a good one. Zack Z. I was running a white phosphorus PVS 14 with a maul, high-end good equipment. Why was I having so much trouble seeing the targets, specifically the Casarda drill? and stage 6? Was I using too much IR and flushing everything out? I could see the target on the walkthrough, just not with my setup on the clock. And I suspect that's exactly what you were doing. So now, here's the deal. The Cassarda drill was particularly problematic for this, although stage 6 was as well. But let's go with the Cassarda drill. The Cassarda drill is the normal stage we do at every brutality match, almost, in which you throw the kettlebell, move to where the kettlebell landed, and shoot the target from the kettlebell's landing position, and you do this for 50 yards. We did this at Midnight Brutality in the closest to no light, not no light, but very low light conditions, in a forested area of the range. So there's trees and overgrowth. And that means there's also trees in front of you, logs, branches, bushes, trees everywhere. And this is where your illuminator really matters. So I looked at that when I was going through the walkthrough. And at the moment, I brought 2 different IR illuminators with me, an Inforce and an old school Surefire, which has a much better, much tighter throw that goes further. But neither one, they're both LED-based IR illuminators. And I looked at that, and where I went with this, and it worked, I can splice some of this in, I turned the gain up on my OPSIN, changed the contrast, and I used no IR illumination at all. And that worked, because what I didn't do, and I suspect this is what happened to you, you created a photonic barrier. So what this means is, and the MAL is good for a really good solution to not have a photonic barrier if you can avoid it. But what it boils down to is when you are, if there's objects in front of you, let's say the target is 100 yards down range, and there's a tree at 10 yards and a tree at 20 yards and another tree at 30 yards. And there was more than that at this range, but something like that. And you pop on your Inforce, which is just an IR flood. You are throwing IR light onto that 10-yard tree, the 20-yard tree, the 30-yard tree, and your night vision equipment will focus, isn't the right word, but will pay attention to the brightest sources that it's receiving. And so what happens is this tree, and that tree become the object of your little night vision's equipment's desires, and the target that's 100 yards downrange just goes into inky blackness. It's just gone. It's completely invisible. Can't see a darn thing. And this is why IR illuminators based on LED can be challenging, and where the MAL honestly could have, and I don't know what you did with it, should be better, because the MAL is not an LED-based IR illuminator. It's a laser-based illuminator that you can focus the throw of the cone of light, because it's a laser, to a smaller degree of arc or a larger degree of arc. So what you would have wanted to do if you wanted to use an IR illuminator on that is you needed to tune your equipment to the situation and throw as little light on the 10-yard, 20-yard, and 30-yard tree that you could, and focus your beam of IR laser designation light illuminator in a smallest cone possible to not splash on the objects around you, to be able to illuminate the target downrange. I just used no IR illumination at all, set the settings on my OPSIN, and was able to see the target as a result. I fired my Inforce once, getting prepped, and realized that that's not going to work, because immediately all I saw were the trees near me and no target downrange. I decided not to use any IR illumination at all. With a MAL or a Kiji or a Luna, you should be able to tune the throw of the light, because they're laser illuminators, and designators in the case of the MAL, to a cone that would only illuminate the area of what you're trying to see without illuminating anything in the range in front of you. By the way, having your light set up poorly on your gun, and even having IR light bang off of or bounce off of your suppressor, can cause a photonic barrier right in front of you. And you can actually make things way worse by turning on your IR illuminator than just not using it at all. So I suspect, I wasn't using your MAL and wasn't there watching you, but I suspect your MAL settings were inappropriate for the condition. And if you had been able to tune the MAL's IR illuminator to a shorter and tighter cone and brightness, because you can adjust the brightness too, you want the least amount of IR light you need in the tightest cone that you need of throw to illuminate what you're trying to shoot at. If it's too bright, you're getting splashback. If the cone's too wide, you're getting splashback. And if you're doing something like this, which has no tune at all it does is throw IR light everywhere, you're getting a lot of photonic barrier right in front of you. And I saw a number of people have that problem on stage 1 with the VTAC, the Cassarda drill, and the O course, because the grass in front of you or the tree or the barricade was lighting up, not the targets downrange. So in this instance, one of the lessons learned from this, and I have some solutions coming that we're going to talk about, IR LED illuminators like this have a purpose inside a room or for some 50-yard applications, maybe, but you really want a laser-based laser illuminator, a MAL, a Kiji, a Luna, and be able to tune that to the situation you're dealing with. And I suspect, considering what you tell me that you couldn't see the targets, you want to spend some time training with the MAL's configuration for light throw, light cone, essentially the focus of the light, and the amount of power you're putting down range for IR illumination was probably more than you needed. You hit objects near you and overwhelmed your night vision equipment with a photonic barrier and could not see the target downrange. Like I said earlier in this Q&A, you can't, I'm not saying you did this. I'm not trying to like denigrate here, but you can't just turn this stuff on and use it. This stuff requires a learning curve, and part of doing this and training in these environments is to learn how to properly configure them, all of them, the laser, the actual optic, your illuminator, and getting them aligned together for the situation you're dealing with at that moment. And that's one of the challenges of night vision shooting. And one of the things that we learned, and hopefully some of you that attended learned at Midnight Brutality, and we will be having future night vision events. That's all the questions for this month. I appreciate all of you so much. Whether you're Utreon or Patreon, you are keeping Inrange alive. We literally have no sponsors, no overlords, no corporate sponsorship whatsoever. The only funding for this channel, the only funding, is from you, the viewer, supporting this directly because you like this content. Whether it's Patreon or Utreon, appreciate you so much. That said, I understand not everyone can do that. It's not possible, the world we live in. The other thing you can do is subscribe to the channel and defeat the overlord's algorithms by sharing content you think is good with your friends. Thanks for watching.